On Michigan's Gold Coast, there was once a fortress disguised as a home. It belonged to a Ford, yet today it is erased from the maps. In the basement, there were welded doors. In the attic, windowless rooms. In the archives, a silence where a legacy should be. This is the story of Stonehurst, the estate built by the other Ford, the glass baron whose name was swallowed by history. Why did this limestone giant vanish? Was it a conspiracy of memory or the brutal arithmetic of time? This is an investigation into the house that glass built and the silence that followed. Chapter 1. Glass, not autos. The Ford fortune. Behind Stonehurst. In the collective memory of America, the name Ford summons a singular image, the black shimmer of a Model T, the rhythm of the assembly line, and the industrial skyline of Dearborn. We think of pistons, gasoline, and the democratization of travel. But before Henry Ford ever revolutionized the wheel, before the Rouge River turned black with automotive runoff, another Ford family was already carving a fortune out of the Michigan landscape. Their medium was not steel, but silica. Their product was not movement, but clarity. This is the story of the glass Fords, John Baptiste and his son, Edward, and the empire of plate glass that funded one of the most enigmatic estates in the Midwest. To understand Stonehurst, one must first understand the brutality of its origins. We tend to view Gilded Age luxury as a product of magic, appearing fully formed on manicured lawns. But the wealth that built Stonehurst was forged in a terrifying heat. Edward Ford did not sell bottles or simple window panes for farmhouses. He manufactured plate glass, thick, architectural, flawless sheets, designed to turn department stores into stages and hotels into palaces. This was the material of the modern city. As Chicago rose from its ashes and Detroit expanded its boulevards, the demand for transparency was insatiable. However, the creation of such clarity was a filthy, dangerous business. In the late 19th century, a glassworks was a place of elemental violence. Sand, soda ash, and limestone were shoveled into furnaces burning at 2,500 degrees. Workers stood before these open maws, their skins searing, their lungs filling with silica dust. The molten rivers were poured onto iron tables, cooled into rough slabs that were clouded and uneven. Then came the grinding. Men spent 12-hour shifts scrubbing the glass with sand and water, followed by a polishing stage using rouge. The result was a mirror-perfect surface that defined the look of progress. The cost was human health. The profits, however, were astronomical. Edward Ford stood at the helm of this volatile industry, commanding a market that had high barriers to entry and even higher rewards. He was an industrialist of the old school, disciplined, unsentimental, and focused on control. The fortune he amassed was substantial enough to rival the timber barons and rail magnates. It was enough to buy a lifestyle of immense privacy. When Edward Ford decided to build his legacy, he did not look to the factory floor for inspiration. He looked to the water, and he looked to the past, determining to build a structure that would sanitize the grit of its creation. Chapter 2. Choosing the Shore. Lake Saint, Clair, and Grosse Pointe. By the 1,890 seconds, the industrial heart of Detroit was thickening. The air was heavy with soot. The streets crowded with the friction of commerce. For the families who owned the factories, the city was the engine of their wealth, but it was no longer a desirable place to sleep. They needed a retreat, a psychological and physical distance from the source of their money. 15 miles northeast, along the sweeping edge of Lake Saint, Clair, a solution was taking shape. This was Grosse Pointe. It was here that the concept of the summer estate began to crystallize into a social mandate. The geography offered a profound relief. The lake, vast enough to feel like an inland sea, yet calm enough for leisure, provided a natural ventilation system. Cool breezes swept off the water, stripping away the humidity and the stench of the industrial city. But more than fresh air, the shoreline offered the ultimate Gilded Age commodity, frontage. To own land here was to own a horizon. Edward Ford acquired a significant parcel, with frontage estimated between 300 and 600 feet. In the fluid records of real estate history, exact numbers often blur, but the scale was undeniable. This was not merely a plot of land, it was a territory. The location was strategic in its isolation. In the era of horse-drawn carriages, and later, the unreliable early automobiles, the distance from Detroit, roughly 40 minutes to an hour, acted as a filter. Only those with the time and means to travel could reach you. The neighbors were not crowds, they were peers. To the north and south, other dynasties were staking their claims, knitting together a community defined by exclusion. They built private clubs, consecrated stone churches, and paved broad boulevards that felt more like parkways than roads. Edward Ford's choice of this specific site was deliberate. It faced east, meaning the house would wake with the sun over the water, bathed in the optimistic light of morning, while the afternoons would settle into the cool shade of the gardens. However, building on the edge of a great lake was an engineering challenge as much as an aesthetic one. The shoreline of Lake St. Clair is a living thing. It breathes with the seasons, expanding with storm surges and contracting with droughts. The winter ice packs could exert crushing pressure on any structure built too close to the edge. The soil, often soft and sandy, required reinforcement. Ford was a man who understood the behavior of difficult materials. Just as glass required tempering to prevent shattering, a lakeside estate required fortifications to prevent erosion. He was not just building a house, he was reclaiming a foothold from nature, preparing the ground for a structure that would declare his family's permanence in a shifting world. Chapter 3. A Fortress on the Water. Architecture and Defense. When the architects presented the plans for Stonehurst, the intention was unmistakable. This was not a whimsical summer cottage, nor was it a porous, airy villa. Stonehurst was a fortress. The design language was English Renaissance Revival, a style that spoke of lineage, gravity, and a connection to the manor houses of the British aristocracy. But beyond the stylistic label lay a defensive posture that revealed the anxieties of its owner. The exterior walls were thick masonry, a blend of stone and brick laid in horizontal courses that emphasized the building's weight. It sat heavy on the land. The windows on the ground floor, particularly those facing the road and the approach, were narrow, almost slit-like. They were set high, preventing anyone from peering in, while allowing those inside to monitor the grounds. The entrance was not a welcoming embrace. It was a controlled funnel, a massive, iron-bound timber door, framed in heavy stone, stood as the only way through. You did not wander into Stonehurst. You were granted admission. Why build a fortress in a resort community? The answer lay in the volatility of the era. The 1892s and early 1900s were periods of intense labor unrest. The gap between the factory owner and the factory worker had widened into a chasm. Strikes were common, and they were often violent. In the glass industry, where skilled labor was essential and conditions were harsh, the threat of sabotage or intimidation was real. Ford knew that the men who worked his furnaces lived very different lives just 15 miles away. A house that looked undefended might invite trouble. A house that looked like a stronghold commanded respect. Furthermore, there was the burden of the name itself. Even before the ascent of Henry, the Ford name in Michigan attracted attention. Newspapers of the time were beginning to develop a ravenous appetite for the private lives of the wealthy. Privacy was becoming a luxury that money had to actively defend. Stonehurst was designed to be opaque to the public gaze. The lower levels were a shell of stone. The upper levels, where the family slept, opened up to the lake, reserving the views for the inhabitants alone. Legends inevitably grew around this architecture. Local rumors whispered of welded steel doors in the basement, designed to turn the cellar into a panic room. There were stories of a windowless chamber in the attic, a place of ultimate retreat, though no blueprints confirm its purpose. Some claim that security staff patrolled the grounds year-round, even when the house was shuttered for winter. Whether these stories were fact or the embellishments of a curious public, they served Ford's purpose. They painted Stonehurst as impenetrable, a place of secrets, effectively keeping the world at arm's length. Chapter 4. Inside Stonehurst, his spaces, her spaces, social spaces. If the exterior of Stonehurst was a shield, the interior was a carefully calibrated machine for living, divided by the rigid social codes of the Gilded Age. The floor plan was not an open flow of space, but a series of distinct territories. His spaces, her spaces, and the stage upon which they performed for society. Edward Ford's domain was anchored on the ground floor, facing the lake. His study was the command center. This was not a library for show. Filled with unread books, it was a workspace. The air here would have smelled of cigar smoke, leather, and the metallic tang of ink. Maps of the Great Lakes shipping routes were pinned to the walls or spread across tables. From his desk, Ford could look out the window and see the very steamers that carried his glass to Chicago and Cleveland. In the corner, concealed within the joinery or sitting heavily on the floor, was a safe, holding contracts, ledgers, and the sensitive correspondence of a monopoly. It was a room of silence and calculation. Upstairs, the atmosphere shifted. This was the territory of Mrs. Ford. Her morning room, or sitting room, was oriented to catch the early light. The palette here was softer creams, rose, and pale blues in contrast to the dark wood and leather below. This room was the logistical hub of the estate's social life. Here, at a small writing desk, the invitations were drafted, the menus for dinner parties were approved, and the complex schedule of the household staff was managed. It was a place of soft power, where the alliances of Detroit's elite were maintained through the ritual of correspondence. Connecting these private spheres was the Great Hall. This was the heart of Stonehurst, a space engineered for acoustics and impression. Though not a ballroom in the regal sense, it could easily accommodate 60 to 100 guests. The parquet floors were laid to withstand dancing, and a musician's alcove was raised slightly above the crowd, allowing a string quartet to fill the room with sound without obstructing the flow of conversation. This was where the Ford wealth was transmuted into social capital. Under the glow of chandeliers likely made of the finest glass, his own factories could produce. Business deals were quietly sealed in corners, and marriages were arranged between dynasties. Hidden away from all of this was the service wing. Stonehurst required a regiment to function. During the summer season, the staff count ranged from 12 to 25 people. They inhabited a parallel world within the house, navigating via steep, narrow back stairs and utilizing separate entrances, invisible from the main drive. Their quarters were utilitarian, their work unending. They stoked the boilers, polished the silver, and ensured that the friction of daily life never impinged on the family's consciousness. The architecture of Stonehurst enforced this separation, ensuring that labor and leisure existed under one roof, but never truly met. Chapter 5. Gardens, terraces, and the lake. Shaping the estate. A great estate is defined not just by its walls, but by how it commands the land. At Stonehurst, the gardens were a declaration of order imposed upon the wildness of the lakeshore. The landscape architecture was formal, rejecting the romantic, overgrown look for geometric precision. An allée of linden trees flanked the main drive, their branches trained to meet overhead, creating a living tunnel that plunged the visitor into green shade before releasing them into the open grandeur of the forecourt. The flower beds were arranged in disciplined parterres. Spring brought regimented lines of tulips. June was heralded by roses chosen for their heavy scent, which would drift through the open windows. These gardens were labor-intensive, requiring a team of groundskeepers to deadhead, weed, and edge the turf by hand. Day after day, the transition from the house to the water was managed through a series of stone terraces. These were broad, outdoor rooms, bounded by heavy balustrades. Here, the family could sit in wicker chairs, elevated above the lawn, watching the water without getting their feet sandy. It was a stage for the theater of summer, Afternoon tea served on silver trays, the clink of porcelain mixing with the sound of the waves. Below the terraces lay the working edge of the estate. The boathouse was a substantial structure, painted to match the main house, housing the skiffs and steam launches that were essential for lakeside life. Extending from the boathouse was a pier, reaching some 30 feet into the lake. This pier was a crucial piece of infrastructure. It served as a dock for pleasure craft. Yes, but also as a commercial loading point. Supplies that were too heavy or awkward for the muddy roads. Coal for the furnaces, crates of wine. New furniture often arrived by barge. But the most critical feature was the one most easily overlooked: the seawall. The battle against the lake was constant. Ford employed engineers to construct stone revetments and breakwaters, designed to shatter the energy of the incoming waves. Every winter, the ice would grind against these stones, and every spring, a crew would have to repair the damage. The beauty of the Stonehurst shoreline was a curated illusion, sustained by money and constant maintenance, holding the line against a body of water that wanted to reclaim the land. Chapter 6. The Life of the House. Teas, music, regattas, rituals. Stonehurst was not a year-round residence. It was a seasonal machine. It roared to life in May and fell silent in October. The rhythm of the house was dictated by the social calendar of Detroit's upper crust. The opening of the house was a ritual in itself. Shutters were unlatched. White dust sheets were whipped off the furniture, and the smell of stale winter air was chased out by the breeze off the lake. The summer season was punctuated by specific, recurring events. Garden teas were the daily currency of interaction. These were not casual drop-ins, but structured affairs where standing was measured by attendance. Philanthropy was the engine of these gatherings. On the terraces of Stonehurst, pledges were made for hospital wings, art museums, and civic improvements. The checkbook was as present as the teacup. Music played a central role in the life of the estate. The Great Hall was frequently the site of chamber music performances. It was a mark of culture to host a touring pianist or a local string quartet. Mrs. Ford, herself a competent musician, would often play the piano in the more intimate music room, the notes of Chopin drifting through the house in the quiet of the evening. These moments of refinement were a way to signal that the Ford money, though new and industrial, had acquired the patina of old-world culture. The climax of the summer was the regatta season. The Grosse Pointe Yacht Club and neighboring estates would organize races that turned the lake into a canvas of white sails. On these days, the reserve of Stonehurst was temporarily suspended. The pier became a crowded grandstand. Guests in nautical blazers and white linens watched through binoculars as the boats tacked against the wind. The boathouse became a bar, serving cold drinks, and the lawn was dotted with parasols. It was a spectacle of leisure, a celebration of the mastery over the water that defined the community. But as September cooled the air, the house began to contract. The asters bloomed in the garden, signaling the end. By October, the staff began the reverse ritual, draining the pipes to prevent freezing, boarding up the lower windows, and covering the statuary. The family retreated to their city residence in Detroit, leaving Stonehurst to stand vigil through the gray, icy winter, a stone shell waiting for the return of the sun. Chapter 7. Glass and Grit. The industry that paid for the view. Lowe's, it is easy to get lost in the romance of tea parties and regattas, to see Stonehurst only as a venue for leisure, but every stone in its walls, every velvet drape in its windows, was paid for by a process of intense industrial grit. The disconnect between the source of the money and the enjoyment of it was a defining feature of the age. While the guests at Stonehurst admired the view through the plate glass windows, few stopped to consider the origins of that glass. The Ford glassworks were vast, smoky complexes where the air was thick with red dust. This rouge, used for polishing, stained the clothes and the skin of the workers. It was a pervasive, clinging substance that marked them as distinct from the owners who lived up the coast. The logistical network that supported Stonehurst was immense. Edward Ford's wealth relied on the Great Lakes shipping channels, A fleet of steamers and barges moved the raw materials, sand from the dunes, coal from the mines to the factories, and then moved the finished crates of glass to the markets of the Midwest. The scale of this operation was global in its ambition, but local in its execution. The map on Ford's study wall was a diagram of this empire. There is a profound irony in the fact that the Ford fortune was built on transparency, on the ability to see through walls. Yet the family used that fortune to build a house designed to be opaque, to hide their lives from the world. The clear glass that modernized American cities paid for the stone walls that shielded the Fords. The silica dust that coated the lungs of the laborers paid for the fresh lake air that the family breathed. This transaction was never spoken of at the garden parties, but it was the silent foundation upon which the entire estate rested. Chapter 8. The Shadow of Henry Ford. Media, confusion, and erasure. In the hierarchy of American industrial legends, there is Henry Ford, and then there is everyone else. This was the tragedy of Edward Ford's legacy. By the early 20th century, the automotive explosion had begun. Henry Ford, with no relation to the Glass family, launched the Model T and captured the imagination of the planet. He was not just a businessman. He was a celebrity, a philosopher, and a media icon. As Henry's star rose, it cast a long, eclipsing shadow over the other Fords. The confusion was immediate and persistent. Reporters, always hungry for a story about the Ford fortune, would conflate the two families. Visitors to Grosse Pointe would point to Stonehurst and assume it was the home of the auto baron. When Henry built his own estate, Fair Lane, in Dearborn, the media narrative solidified. Fair Lane was the Ford estate. Stonehurst became a footnote. This erasure was not an active conspiracy, but a passive inevitability. The public mind struggles to hold two dynasties with the same name. Ford meant cars. It meant wheels. It meant the future. Plate glass, by comparison, was static. It was a background material. Edward Ford, by nature a private man, did not fight for the spotlight. He did not issue manifestos or give bombastic interviews. He allowed the confusion to stand because it afforded him a degree of anonymity. However, this lack of distinction proved fatal to the historical memory of Stonehurst. Legends began to circulate that Henry Ford had tried to buy Stonehurst and was rejected, or that he wanted the Glass family erased from the social register. There is no evidence for these dramatic feuds. The truth is quieter. The sheer volume of Henry Ford's fame simply drowned out the history of the glassworks. Stonehurst became the wrong Ford house, an architectural orphan in a city obsessed with the internal combustion engine. The name that should have been its greatest asset became the primary reason for its obscurity. Chapter 9. Decline and dispersal. Taxes, storms, staff, and loss. The end of Stonehurst did not come with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing erosion. The golden age of the estate lasted barely 30 years. By the 1920s, the economic and social tides were turning against the great houses of the Gilded Age. The first blow was the income tax and the rising property taxes of the lakefront. What was once affordable land became a financial liability. Simultaneously, the labor market collapsed. The distinct class of servants willing to live in attic rooms and work 18-hour days began to vanish. The children of the original staff found jobs in the booming auto factories, where the pay was better and the hours defined. Stonehurst, designed to be run by 20 people, could not function with 5. Wings of the house were closed off. Dust sheets remained on the furniture even in summer. The gardens, once manicured to the millimeter, began to grow wild. Nature delivered its own verdict. In 1926, a massive storm system swept across the Great Lakes. The waves of Lake St. Clair, driven by gale-force winds, hammered the Stonehurst seawall. The stones shifted. The breakwater failed. The cost to repair the engineering works was astronomical, and by this time, the family's liquidity was not what it had been. They chose not to rebuild the defenses. The lake began to eat the beach. The Great Depression of the 1932 sealed the estate's fate. The lavish parties ceased. The house became a burden, a white elephant of limestone that consumed coal and taxes while offering little in return. The dispersal began. It started with the contents. Furniture was sold quietly to dealers. The great chandeliers were unhooked and auctioned off. Intricate wood carvings and marble fireplaces were stripped from the walls and sold as architectural salvage to newer, smaller homes. Finally, the land itself was carved up. The expansive acreage that ensured privacy was subdivided into smaller lots for suburban development. The fortress was flanked, its isolation broken. The house stood for a while longer, a hollow shell stripped of its organs, before finally succumbing to the wrecking ball. It was not destroyed by a revolution, but by the simple, crushing weight of overhead costs. Chapter 10: What Survives, Archives, Fragments, and Why It Matters Now. Today, if you drive along Lakeshore Road, you will not find Stonehurst. The site is occupied by modern luxury homes, manicured and anonymous. The limestone fortress is gone, but it is not entirely lost. History has a way of persisting in fragments. The survival of Stonehurst is now archival, in the Burton Historical Collection at the Detroit Public Library, and in the files of the Grosse Pointe Historical Society. The estate lives on in black and white. There are photographs of the Great Hall, empty and echoing. There are grainy images of the Regattas, capturing the ghosts of a summer afternoon in 1910. There are guest books, their pages filled with the signatures of a vanished elite, documenting the network of power that once operated here. Physical pieces of the house are scattered across the Midwest, often unrecognized. A fireplace mantel sits in a law office in Birmingham. A stained glass panel hangs in a private home in Ann Arbor, its owners unaware that it once filtered the light of the Ford glass fortune. A heritage marker, a small bronze plaque on a stone, stands near the original property line. 83 words, trying to summarize a world. Why does this matter? Why mourn a mansion built by a monopolist? Because Stonehurst is a perfect case study in the fragility of legacy. It reminds us that even the most solid stone cannot withstand the indifference of history. It teaches us that Ford is a plural story, not a singular one. It represents the hundreds of industrial estates across the Great Lakes region that have been wiped from the earth, taking their stories of labor, ambition, and design with them. Preservation is not just about keeping buildings standing. It is about keeping the memory of them alive. It is about acknowledging the other Fords and the complex, dusty, beautiful history of the region. If this story resonates with you, if you are drawn to the mysteries of the Gilded Age and the buildings that time forgot, like this video to support Deep Dive History. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. I will be turning my attention to the Newberry Mansion next, the house on the river that became a ruin, and I want to hear from you. What lost estate in your city deserves to be remembered? Do you have family photos or documents from the glass era? Let me know in the comments. History survives only when we decide it matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching until the end. How did you feel about this video? Let us know in the comments below. Empire Legacies truly appreciates your support. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.